everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing, I guess broadly, the impact, as I expect it, of the devotion sheet on Pioneer Masters. I was originally planning to focus on 5-color gates this week, but my early drafts with the devotion sheet have made it feel very significant in a way that I think is worth discussing and focusing on more. Because I think basically the effect is a little bit more dramatic than I realized. I was thinking more about the effect of the devotion cards, but I think that the real impact of this sheet, specifically as it relates to the multicolor decks, is more about cards costing double pip in a single color. So there are a lot more cards that you want to play at low rarities that cost like green or white or black or whatever. And my approach to drafting 5-color gates before this sheet was to go pretty far out of my way to avoid playing things that cost CC, so two of the same symbols. And that's harder to do, or there's more incentive not to do that. And so it meaningfully conflicts with the normal 5-color incentives in the format. So using the bonus sheet cards now kind of requires a paradigm shift from what I saw as the old paradigm being kind of heroic aggro decks against spell-based control decks. And I think partially the previous sheet was a spell-based sheet, which pushed toward that. But also the nature of heroic as the aggressive mechanic is fairly punishing to blocking, because it just rewards combat tricks a lot. And so defending yourself with spells is generally better than defending yourself with creatures. But defending yourself with spells doesn't add to devotion. And the aggro decks are generally more aggressive than most devotion cards. So taking advantage of these cards just requires doing things differently. So the two commons that care about devotion are Nylea's Disciple and Disciple of Phoenix. Nylea's Disciple is 2 green for a 3/3 ETB, gain life equal to your devotion to green, and Disciple of Phoenix is 2 black 1/3 ETB, your opponent reveals cards equal to your devotion to black, and then they discard one of them. I think both of these are reasonably strong. Nylea's Disciple is better against aggressive decks, and Disciple of Phoenix is better against control decks. I think Disciple of Phoenix is better overall by a decent amount than Nylea's Disciple. Those are both black-green cards. Both of them kind of want you to have a lot of creatures, because creatures are the primary way that you're building devotion. So those have the overlapping incentives of playing a lot of creatures in black-green, which is what black-green wanted to do anyway, but it didn't feel like there was enough reason to before. Now, Nemesis of Mortals, the 6-mana 5/5 that costs 1 less for each creature in your graveyard, has a much better place in the format. There's more reason to be just a creature-heavy, permanent-based green-black deck, and the Disciples help kind of hedge, the green one hedges against the aggressive red decks. The black one is really good for stopping the Gates decks from kind of going over the top of you, because you can pull their big payoff out of their hand, and you're, playing a lot of threatening creatures and pressuring them and have a decent amount of power and stuff. So you can kind of hang with the late game decks thanks to Disciple of Phoenix and some of the other synergy cards and just new cards. Specifically, I guess, kind of the big draw to that deck is Abhorrent Overlord, 5 black black, 6/6 flyer, ETB, make 1/1 flyers equal to your devotion to black, and then at the beginning of your upkeep you have to sacrifice a creature. This is downshifted from rare, and it's really, really powerful. If you have a deck that can reliably get to 7 mana, when you cast it, it's really strong. If your opponent has a sweeper, it's not very good. If they have a counterspell, it's not very good. But otherwise, it's usually going to make like 4 to 6 1/1 flyers, which is more than enough fodder to feed the 6/6 flyer. If they kill the 6/6 flyer, then you have all these 1/1 flyers that are usually good enough. And then there are a bunch of other things that work well when you make a bunch of creatures, like your Nantuku Husks and Zulaport Cutthroats and stuff. So that uncommon kind of pulls black devotion together in a very real way that makes all of the black creatures a bit more appealing. And it fits well in green-black because that deck is good at getting to 7 mana. You have like the spawn from Catacomb Sifter and getting a land off of District Guide and, just whatever else. Like a defensive deck with green cards is generally going to make a lot of land drops. And so I think black-green is just a much better deck than it was before. As for white, you get like Wingsteed Rider and Fiendslayer Paladin that are both 1 white, and I think they both play pretty well in the white heroic decks. But because they cost double white, they don't play well in the like red-based aggro heroic decks that are splashing white. You really have to be a lot more serious about being white, which I think kind of pulls the aggro cards in a couple different directions, which I think means that there are more kind of like different aggro decks that you're going to face, like white's doing more different things, which I guess means that a little bit less the focus in defending yourself is specifically defending yourself against aggro decks. And Wingsteed Rider, I think, means that like being able to deal with like big aggressive flyers is a little bit more important. And Fiendslayer Paladin, I think, is a pretty big buff to bestow creatures in general, because it's a really good body to bestow on, since it like dodges a lot of the removal, and when you bestow on it, it wins most combat. Another really big consideration is just the gods. They're all mythic rare, so you don't see any of them very often, but there are 15 of them, so collectively they do appear reasonably often. And they're mostly pretty strong, and mostly pretty strongly incentivize getting devotion to turn them on, which leads into this paradigm shift where before the bonus sheet came in, there weren't really any decks that would naturally be able to turn on any of the gods because of this like aggressive red versus spell-based control decks paradigm. No one's doing that well. So now anyone who gets these gods is incentivized to figure out like, okay, how do I play a very different deck than what I'd been playing before that lets me take advantage of these things? And all of the double pip commons that come in make that a lot easier, and so they have a place even if they're in one of the colors that doesn't have as much devotion support at low commonalities. So, or just at all. Like, there aren't that many devotion cards, but the gods mean that you kind of always care about any pips if you have those. Also, the gods mean that cards like Unravel the Aether that weren't very appealing before, like, yeah, you might find something to hit with them, but it's too narrow to play. Now I think Unravel the Aether, 1 and a green, shuffle an artifact or enchantment into a Tender's library, becomes a really important sideboard card for like the best of 3 drafts in day 2 of the Arena Open, and a card that you can consider main decking in best of 1. If you're worried about gods. Also, like Selesnya Charm is another really good answer to gods that gains a decent amount of value. So what all this means for the Gates deck is that you can just draft it the way that I did before and accept that things are a bit harder for you because you're going to have to you're going to get hit by discard effects more. Like Disciple of Phoenix is going to be really good against you, and there are just more cards that you can't really take advantage of. Or you can switch to drafting around a base color and then using gates to splash other stuff and targeting them in. So with the previous approach that I had to 5-color gates, I was basically targeting a mana base of 10 to 12 gates, 0 to 2 Evolving Wilds, and 4 to 7 basic lands, with one of each basic land usually. Now, I think that there's another approach where you're like base something and then playing a bunch of gates and splashing stuff and trying to avoid cards that cost AB, like Selesnya Charm, where it's 2 different colors. And like if you're base black, you wouldn't play Selesnya Charm, but if you're base white or base green, you would. And then playing like a lot of the same basic land, maybe 1 or 2 of a different basic land, and then probably more like 10 gates. And I think that strategy is challenging to draft. I'm not sure if it's like actually harder or if it just requires shifting expectations a lot early in the draft to account for it, but it kind of requires like figuring out that a color is open and not like the problem is that you're more restricted in which cards you're looking for because you're really trying to primarily take cards in that color, which makes it harder to like opportunistically take gates and then just kind of take whatever in the other packs. So I think it is actually harder to draft that way, and I don't know how well it's going to come together, but it's kind of a way to have it all in terms of like getting some of the devotion stuff and getting some of the gate stuff. But I think mostly the gate stuff is just going to be a little bit less emphasized this time around than it was before. It'll still be present. It's just like a little bit less clean. The red aggressive elements also still exist. Blocking is still somewhat challenging. You still need to build your deck with beating the red aggressive decks in mind. So you're still going to prioritize cheap removal and good early blockers. And you might just want to focus more on permanents that grant you some kind of card advantage rather than spells that do that. So you're not like cutting into your removal or early game, but your mid game is more of the like Archaeomancer and Disciple of Phoenix and the Scab, the 3/2 that returns something from your graveyard, that kind of stuff as like your card advantage plan. So basically just like, yeah, red aggro is still real. You still definitely don't want to trim. Like, the struggle that I've had so far in my drafts with the bonus sheets is I still think removal is important, but I keep not ending up with it. And I think it's that I'm not quite prioritizing it enough, maybe because I get pulled into, oh, I'll find removal later. I want this permanent that's going to work well with my devotion thing or something like that. And I think that I really want to keep prioritizing removal very highly. Getting back to more of an overview of the cards that are available, maybe I should have talked about this earlier. There are not that many devotion cards. I talked about the 2 commons. White has only Evangel of Heliod, which is 4 white, 1/3, make 1/1s equal to your devotion to white. I think this card's fine if you have a reason to care about being wide, but not very powerful. Like, it's so much weaker than Abhorrent Overlord for 1 less mana. So I view it as like an okay card in some of the white-black decks or something, but not a card that really shapes the format. Blue has no devotion cards whatsoever outside of the gods. Red has only Fanatic of Mogus, which is 3 in a red for a 4/2 ETB, deal damage to your opponent equal to your devotion to red. This card's really strong in the right deck. It gives some more reach to the red aggro decks, but they're not likely to have super high devotion. Oh, true. Blue does have Master of Waves at Mythic. That's in the set, but not on the devotion bonus sheet, so I forgot about it. But it is still present. Anyway, red, I think, like, Fnatic of Mogus is good, but I don't think that you're likely to have a ton of devotion to red just because your opponent is going to be involved in destroying your creatures, and you're going to be, like, trading off to push damage sometimes and stuff. Still strong, still good in the mono red decks, but I don't think it's, like, very format warping. It's just a card that can go in your mono red deck that's a reasonable 4-drop. Black and green, in addition to the commons that each of them have, also each have an uncommon. I already talked about the black uncommon, Abhorrent Overlord. Green has the Hunter, like Reverend Hunter or something. 2 and a green for a 1/1 that gets +1/+1 counters equal to your devotion to green when it enters. I think this is a reasonably good card if you're heavy green, but also, like, not very format warping. So basically, I don't think that the devotion specifically matters as much as just, like, the different nature of casting costs in the format outside of black and green. But in black or green, especially in black, it can be pretty important. Another deck that I want to talk about, the early data for the devotion sheet, so just like at the time of recording this, the data for the last 2 days, shows white-black as the winningest archetype by a pretty wide margin, but a tiny sample size. This has been, before this bonus sheet, the only non-red archetype with numbers comparable to the red archetypes in terms of overall win rates. And it plays pretty well against red. The white-black gold cards block well against the red aggressive cards. The 2/1 that dies into a 1/1 flyer and a Cartel Aristocrat. The 2/2 that you can sacrifice thing to get protection from a color are both good defensive bodies against these aggro decks. And you have, like, pretty good cheap removal. So the deck lines up well against red, and then I think it plays well with this new bonus sheet, because before it was kind of the deck that was most interested in having, like, a wide board with a lot of sticky creatures, and now you just get payoffs for doing that. So I kind of expect that it will continue to perform well. I like its metagame positioning. I think that it's better than it was, and it was already good. And I expect it to continue to be one of the best performing decks. It was drafted in the last 2 days, like, well under half as often as Boros, maybe closer to, like, a third as much or a quarter as much or something. I suspect white-black to be more drafted than it has been by the time the Arena Open drafts are happening. So I think white-black is definitely something to look out for, keep in mind, consider how your decks are lining up against it, because there's a lot of synergy there, and I think it lines up well in the format now and uses the new cards well. So that's kind of where I'm at with the format. Basically, I think red aggro is pretty similar to how it's been. Gates is considerably more awkward, but I wouldn't call it dead. White-black and green-black, I think, are kind of the big winners. I think they have a lot more going for them. Blue, I think, is a bit worse off generally. Obviously, blue liked the spell sheet more than it likes the permanent sheet. Obviously, that's not to say, I'm going to strictly avoid blue or anything. I think Archaeomancer is a good card that plays well if you get, like, a bunch of removal, which I'm still interested in having. But I think that, especially since kind of one of blue's big payoffs is Treasure Cruise, which wants stuff to go to the graveyard, that's kind of at odds with wanting stuff to be in play. So, of course, it's going to play awkwardly with the incentives in the devotion set compared to the incentives when you're just trying to fill your deck with spells, and there's no reason not to do that. So, bit of a hit to blue, bit of a buff to black, basically. Red stays similar, and green and white, I think, get a little bit better. Primarily paired with black, but also I think that the one white cards kind of give a lot more reason for white-based aggro to exist, and I think that they both play pretty well in like green-white aggro, because that's kind of where you're using a lot of the bestow stuff, and like getting the evasive common that's good to target with your enchantments in green-white is pretty good. Fiendslayer helps those decks defend against the red aggro decks. So, yeah, that's kind of where I think the format's at going into the Arena Open, which is using the Devotion bonus sheet for the drafts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions. What should you think about when considering how your deck lines up against black-white? It's a reasonable question. Black-white is primarily pressuring you with small creatures, some of about like a portion, less than half, but a decent portion of them are small flyers. Pilgrim's Eyes and 1/1 Spirits and Extort Bats. They're not very fast, but they're pretty good at like pushing little bits of damage through from Extort and those flyers, and they can like make Cartel Aristocrat unblockable. Blocking Nantuko Husk is challenging. If you block with a big creature, then they can like sack little creatures to have their Husk beat your big creature. You can, take the to a turn from it for a while, but at some point it becomes, well, I have to block this, or they can just sack all their creatures and kill me. So they take a while to kill you, which means that you can outrace them, except it's kind of hard to pressure them because their stuff blocks well. They're good at gumming up the board, and they gain some life. So it's kind of better to go over the top, just like do something that beats whatever they had going on. Gates Ablaze type stuff, Abhorrent Overlord type stuff. Gate Colossus is really hard for them to deal with because they usually don't have very many creatures that can actually block it. Trying to get into combat with small creatures is generally going to go poorly for you because their small creatures are just better at it since they like die into stuff or whatever. Removal's pretty important for killing key creatures like Zilpart Cutthroat and Mentor the Meek, but it's also a little bit awkward because it lines up poorly against a lot of their creatures. So I guess like when you're thinking about how your deck lines up against black-white, you need to think about, like, do I have good ways to finish the game if my opponent is planning to chump block a lot? Rogue's Passage or Trample, Selesnya Charm, that kind of thing. Or do I have a way to just, like, go way over the top with something that's going to, like, make a lot of creatures or, maybe just kill them like Erectus' return kind of effect? Or can I trump them in the air? They have flyers, but they're mostly small. So if you have your own flyers or reach creatures, that's pretty good at cutting off a lot of their persistent pressure to give you time for whatever your plan is ultimately against them. If you have ways to gain life that can help with their kind of like extort you out plan, like a medium amount of life gain can go decently far, buying you extra time against black-white. Those are the general things I'd be thinking about. Do you think monocolor decks become viable, or is a small splash pretty much always worth it? I think that monocolor decks were viable. Mono red in particular was doing really well, but other monocolor decks also had pretty good win rates. Monocolor decks are better now because the devotion obviously likes it when all of your cards are contributing. The hard part about mono is obviously always just the seat needs to be very open. You need to like not have two other people in your draft who are drafting the same color most of the time, and ideally not have someone next to you in that color. But when the seat lines up, it's certainly, good to be monocolor. Like I think mono red's still going to be good, and I think like there's a lot more reason to try to be mono black now. I could see mono blue. Mono white makes a lot of sense. I can imagine mono green. So yeah, I think that monocolored decks will be somewhat more common now for sure, since both the devotion thing and just the stuff that gets a lot like your mana's a lot easier if you're mono when there are a lot of things that cost CC or 1 CC. Have any of the Theros gods felt underwhelming, or are they all premier bombs? They certainly aren't all created equal. Like, I think like Krufix and Karametra are not on the same level as like Eureka or Thassa. I'm not going to try to like rank all of them. In general, they matter, but some aren't that good. If you're not sure, just check the 17 land stats this weekend. Give it time for enough data to be present, but 17 lands should have reasonable sample size on them by the weekend, I would expect. Do Evolving Wilds and Pilgrim's Eye have a place in the new kind of Gates deck? I think they always did, but yes, fixing is more important now because the mana is harder. Because you might want some stuff that costs CC in your Gates decks, and so that means that like where before I would often take a gate over Evolving Wilds, I think now it makes sense to basically always take Evolving Wilds over a gate. And similarly, before I kind of tried to avoid Pilgrim's Eye because it was so much worse than District Guide, where now I'm just like, yeah, it's more likely that I'm going to want all that stuff that I can get. Notes on sequencing lands. I did mess it up recently. So I guess my primary note is just really think about the spells that you're going to be casting over your next few turns. There's not really much more to it than that. Like the trick to sequencing your lands is basically always just take the time to think through what you're going to be spending your mana on the next few turns, where you can afford to, which turn you want to take off on your tapped lands versus untapped lands, and be sure to take into account cards that you can draw that would be important to cast, and how likely it is to draw cards that will need mana on certain turns or give you mana on certain turns. Like, how likely is it that I'm going to draw an untapped land this turn if I'm going to want to like play on curve that turn. If you're playing a bunch of gates, you're probably not going to draw an untapped land, so it might be worth taking off playing a 2-drop to be able to play a 3-drop based on when you're going to play the one basic land you have or something. So I don't know that I can get much more into it than really take a minute, think through your land plays, just like have a lot of intentionality about how you play your lands. Don't just like, play your lands arbitrarily. Could a Gates deck with Cures, Followers, Satyrs, and more of the 5-color Gates pull off a more CC-based 5-color deck? I mean, you are describing a mana base that is better at generating CC, so yes, it would be better at doing that. Obviously, I think that playing the 5-color Gate is a reasonably high cost, and I don't know that you're going to want like a lot of different CC stuff. Like if you're trying to get devotion payoffs, having CC stuff in different colors doesn't really help you. I guess my question is, basically just like, is the juice worth the squeeze there? Like, are you getting paid off enough for the amount of effort that you're putting into it, both in terms of taking the cards that support it and the extra speed bumps that you're getting with the 5-color Gate and the extra, like, basically mana sources that you're playing with the Satyrs that are going to cut into your overall power level? So, it's doable if your early picks go in such a way that that's what you need to be trying to support, but I wouldn't expect that to be kind of like my go-to plan. How has Archaeomancer felt comparable to Possessed Scab? Archaeomancer has not felt comparable to Possessed Scab for me so far. I think that there are some decks where it might be kind of like that, but it has felt harder on my mana to cast in terms of like I would rather in a lot of my decks that are trying to have that effect cost blue black than blue blue. It's meaningfully smaller and more restrictive in what you can get back. So while I am optimistic about there being a place for Archaeomancer, Possessed Scab has certainly felt like a stronger, more appealing, and more broadly useful card than Archaeomancer. I've had good success with Extort to force through damage. Should I be on the lookout for strategies like this and Mill as alt win cons? Funny to think of damage with Extort as an alt win con, but yeah, I mean, I do think that like Sphinx's Tutelage is a reasonable card to kind of like plan around, and I do think that Extort is a pretty strong mechanic, and there are a lot of decks that are built to play defensively because you kind of have to do that to prepare for the red decks, and when they play against each other, they're often bad at ending the game quickly, and the game can kind of come down to these like non-combat focused wins. So I definitely think that they're still worth like watching for. So are you still playing one of each basic in your gates deck and trying to have the gates be more focused on your primary color? That's good work if you can get it. I mean, like if you have a Pilgrim's Eye and play all the basics and then all your gates happen to be your primary color, that would probably be optimal. But I think that like with a lot of these gates decks, if you're trying to get, 8 or more gates, you kind of just have to take the gates you can when you see them. So that leads me to want to try to have a mana base that's, maybe relying on Pilgrim's Eye and Evolving Wilds less because I'm maybe not going to have those basics. But it really all depends on kind of like, there are a few different ways to make the mana work, and it's just going to depend on like, are you seeing a lot of gates of the same color? Are you able to choose your primary color based on the fact that your gates are all that color? It's, I think that building the mana base for the five color decks is always a little bit tricky. I think previously in this format, we were kind of on easy mode where there weren't a lot of things that we really wanted to play that cost CC, and so you could kind of just like grab all the gates you saw, play some like District Guides and Pilgrim's Eyes, one of each basic, and figure it out. Now I think you have to pay more attention to which color the gates you're taking are and how you're gonna like what your basic lands are gonna look like and how you're gonna get your double colored stuff to work if you're gonna play it. Which kind of goes back into what I was saying about I think it's just harder now. I do think Archaeomancer going to the graveyard, unlike Possessed Scab, is meaningful. I like the defensive loop of Archaeomancer Pulsive Marasa, where you just pulse your Archaeomancer, gain 6 life, play it, block something, it dies, pulse it back, gain 6 life again. I think that that's kind of slow and clunky and not super relevant in a lot of matchups, but pretty valuable as a thing to be able to do against red. A little bit of a dimension that Possessed Scab doesn't have. But again, overall, I think Possessed Scab is still the more powerful card. In the white-based heroic decks with Fiendslayer Paladin, are you interested in Laganabam Trailblazer, even though it starts as an 0-4? Just depends on how easy it is for you to target it and how much you're interested in the defensive card. Like the 0-4 is a reasonable defensive creature against the red decks. if you have like a good amount of flying, it can be like pretty non-terrible as a baseline. And if you have a good amount of stuff that incidentally targets it, it like scales pretty well when you get to actually use its heroic. So I wouldn't completely write it off, but it's certainly not like a premium card for those decks, but it's, reasonable sometimes, I guess. Do the new Gates mana bases make Wild Slash worse? No. I mean, it's still a single pip card that, I guess, so it's single red. It's an important early defensive tool. The challenging part is that you might have fewer red sources because you're not going to be playing double red cards. Like, you're not going to be a red-based Gates deck, I suspect, most of the time. Because there aren't any, like, red cards that you're looking to play, basically, outside of rare. So, that means that Wild Slash is going to be one of your, like, splash colors. But, like I was saying, I kind of want to, with the splash stuff, avoid stuff that costs 2 of my splash colors. But I would like to draft expecting that I'm going to prioritize Wild Slash, and I can build my mana base in such a way that I'm going to be able to cast it early. Because I just think it's so important to those decks to have access to that effect. So, I think Wild Slash is still very good for the control decks. Alright, so it occurs to me that I failed at my normal plug in my transition from kind of my opening discussion to answering questions. So if anyone is looking to support the podcast, join the Patreon. Check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. That's going to be it for this week. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be back next week with a topic that I haven't fully thought through. I think it's just going to be a return to Foundations. Feels a little weird after, spending a lot of time with it and taking some time off, but I think that's where we're at unless I think of something else that's going on. So bye for now, and I will see you next week.
Prepare for light speed.